Hi guys, this is Connie, back for some more Connie Reads White Fragility. We are in the middle of chapter 6, ultimately titled Anti-Blackness. And these chapters are really long and very wordy, so hopefully we will get through the end of this chapter. I think this is part 2. Anti-Blackness is rooted in misinformation, fables, perversions, projections, and lies. It is also rooted in a lack of historical knowledge and an inability or unwillingness to trace the effects of history into the present. But perhaps most fundamentally, anti-Blackness comes from deep guilt about what we have done and continue to do, the unbearable knowledge of our complicity with the profound torture of Black people from past to present. While the full trauma of this torture in its various forms, both physically and psychologically, is only borne by African Americans, there is a kind of moral trauma in it for the collective white, or for the white collective. In his revolutionary book, My Grandmother's Hands, social worker and therapist Resmaa Menakem, I apologize in advance if I totally butchered your name, refers to white supremacy as white body supremacy, to argue that white supremacy is a form of trauma that is stored in our collective bodies. Quote, many African Americans know trauma intimately, from their own nervous systems, from the experiences of people they love, and most often from both. But African Americans are not alone in this. A different but equally real form of racialized trauma lives in the bodies of most white Americans. Unquote. Our projections allow us to bury this trauma by dehumanizing and then blaming the victim. If Blacks are not human in the same ways that we white people are human, our mistreatment of them doesn't count. We are not guilty. They are. If they are bad, it isn't unfair. In fact, it is righteous. There is a curious satisfaction in the punishment of Black people, the smiling faces of the white crowd picnicking at lynchings in the past, and the satisfied approval of white people observing mass incarceration and execution in the present. White righteousness, when inflicting pain on African Americans, is evident in the glee the white collective derives from blackface and depictions of Blacks as apes and gorillas. We see it in the compassion toward white people who are addicted to opiates and the call to provide them with services versus the mandatory sentencing perpetuated against those addicted to crack. We see it in the concern about the forgotten white working class so critical to the outcome of the last presidential election, with no concern for Blacks, who remain on the bottom of virtually every social and economic measure. As Coates points out, toiling Blacks are in their proper state. Toiling whites raise the specter of white slavery. Coates refers to white people as dreamers in the dream, falsely believing that they are actually white. I take this to mean that whites can only be white if someone is not white, if someone is the opposite of white. White is a false identity, an identity of false superiority. In that sense, whiteness isn't real. The dream is the perfect world, unpolluted by Blacks. If whites are to construct this world, Blacks must be separated through state violence. Yet they still must exist, for existence of Blacks provides the needed other against which many whites may rise. Thus, white identity depends in particular on the projection of inferiority onto Blacks and the impression this inferior status justifies for the white collective. To put it bluntly, I believe that the white collective fundamentally hates Blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of perpetuating immeasurable harm, and that our gains come through the subjugation of others. We have a particular hatred for uppity Blacks, those who dare to step out of their place and look us in the eye as equals. The messages that circulate relentlessly across the generations reinforce the white belief that Blacks are inherently undeserving, in parentheses it says, a frankly outrageous belief given the state-sanctioned robbery of their labor. We heard this message in the narrative of welfare cheats and welfare queens in the Reagan era. We see it today when commentators slam National Football League players who kneel during the national anthem and exercise their right to protest police brutality as ungrateful, and when former Congressman Joe Walsh declares that Stevie Wonder is another ungrateful black multimillionaire, unquote. We see it when Robert Jeffress, Jeffres, Robert Jeffress, a lot of S's, Dallas evangelical pastor and advisor to the President of the United States, claims that NFL players who protest police brutality against African Americans should thank God they don't have to worry about being shot in the head, quote, like they would be in North Korea, unquote. That's not the point. We see it in the outrage of the crowd of white progressives who show up to hear Bernie Sanders speak in Seattle and were asked by black activists to grant 4.5 minutes of silence to honor Michael Brown, an unarmed black man shot by police in Ferguson, Missouri. "How dare you?" the crowd cried. Carol Anderson, in her book, White Rage, argues that, quote, the trigger for white rage inevitably is black advancement. It is not the mere presence of black people that is the problem. Rather, it is blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. She continues, the truth is that despite all this, a black man was elected President of the United States, the ultimate advancement, and thus the ultimate affront. Perhaps not surprisingly, voting rights were severely curtailed. The federal government was shut down, and more than once the office of the president was shockingly, openly, and publicly disrespected by other elected officials. Anti-blackness is a complex and confusing stew of resentment and benevolence, for we also use blacks to feel warm-hearted and noble. We are drawn to those who cast their eyes downward in our presence, the ones we can save from the horrors of their black lives with our abundance and kindness. Consider an example I often use in my presentations, The Blind Side, a hugely popular movie for which Sandra Bullock received an Academy Award. This film is a cogent example of whites as the racially benevolent side of the coin. The film is based on the true story of a family, the Tulhys, who rescued Michael O'Hare, a black man who came from impoverished family circumstances and went on to become an NFL player. Although the movie was popular with white audiences, many problematic racial narratives are reinscribed in the film. In fact, there are no black characters who do not reinforce negative racial stereotypes. O'Hare himself is portrayed as a childlike gentle giant who lives in abject poverty. Sprinkled in are his drug-addicted single mother with multiple children from unknown fathers, the incompetent welfare worker, the uppity lawyer, and the menacing gang members in his drug-infested and crime-ridden neighborhood. In one pivotal scene, O'Hare returns to his former neighborhood. As he walks down the street, he is surrounded by a gang that tries to intimidate him. While he considers his limited options, Mrs. Tulhy arrives and confronts the gang members, who quickly back down and retreat. Rescued by Mrs. Tulhy, I don't know how to say it, O'Hare is returned back to safe white suburbia. The scene makes it clear. The only way O'Hare could be saved from the terrors of his own black community is through the benevolence and bravery of a white family. In the film, white professionals discuss O'Hare as if he were developmentally disabled. In parentheses, he certainly comes off as such. He is passive and inarticulate throughout the movie. His teachers note that on his IQ test, he scored in the bottom percentile in, quote, ability to learn. but in the top percentile in protective instinct. Quote, protective instinct. As a professor of education who has never heard of a test measuring protective instinct, I've been unable to find evidence of this bizarre measurement. It is highly problematic that O'Hare as a black male is portrayed as severely lacking in intellectual abilities, but exceptional in something instinctual. His limited intellectual capacity is reinforced throughout the film. For example, when the youngest child of the Tohei household has to teach O'Hare how to play football. According to the film, O'Hare is never able to understand the rules of the game, so Mrs. Tuohi, how do you even say that last name? Appeals to his protective instinct by telling him to pretend one of his new white family members is going to be hurt. Once his instincts are engaged, rather than his intellect, he is unstoppable on the field. In a particularly insulting scene, the white child who tried unsuccessfully to teach O'Hare how to play football sits at a table negotiating a contract for him with powerful adult men while O'Hare sits in the background, mute. This film, told from the white perspective and enthusiastically received by audiences, reinforces some very important dominant ideologies. Bullet. They're just little dots. That's what bullets are in books. Bullet. White people are saviors of black people. New bullet. Some black children may be innocent, but black adults are morally and criminally corrupt. New bullet. Whites who are willing to save or otherwise help black people at seemingly great personal cost are noble, courageous, and morally superior to other whites. New bullet. Individual black people can overcome their circumstances, but usually only with the help of white people. Next bullet. Black neighborhoods are inherently dangerous and criminal. Next bullet. Virtually all blacks are poor, incompetent, and unqualified for their jobs. They belong to gangs, are addicted to drugs, and are bad parents. Next bullet. The most dependable route for black males to escape the inner city is through sports. Next bullet. White people are willing to deal with individual, deserving black people, but whites do not become part of the black community in any meaningful way beyond charity work. Of course, O'Hare also brings redemption to the whites who save him. The film ends with a voiceover from Mrs. Tuohi, a Christian claiming it was God's will that this boy be saved. Presumably, in parentheses, presumably because his talent on the field made him more profitable and thus valuable to white people. The Tuhois, of course, are the good whites who have to deal with the prejudice of the individual bad whites they encounter at the country club and other places. In this way, the racist equal bad, not racist equal good binary is so. The racist is bad, the not racist good binary is also reinforced. The film is fundamentally and insidiously. The film is fundamentally and insidiously anti-black. White racial socialization engenders many conflicting feelings toward African Americans. Benevolence, resentment, superiority, hatred, and guilt roil barely below the surface and erupt at the slightest breach, yet can never be explicitly acknowledged. Our need to deny the bewildering manifestations of anti-blackness that reside so close to the surface makes us irrational, and that irrationality is at the heart of white fragility and the pain it causes people of color. And that is chapter 6. So be careful with that and enjoy, please and thank you, and I will see you for the next installment. Have a great one.